Good morning, students. Let's start this lovely morning with a quotation that if you run alone in life, it is known as race. But if God is running with you in your life, it is known as grace. So, have a graceful life, students. So, we'll continue with the topic government budget, and we are done with the components of government budget, that is government receipt, budget receipt and budget expenditure. Now today I am going to explain you about types of government budget. There are two types of government budget, as you can see on the screen, that is balanced budget and unbalanced budget. Now balanced budget is the one wherein government receipts are equal to government expenditure. That means whatever spendings are there of the government, that is equal to the income or the revenue generated of the government. Unbalanced budget is divided into two parts: surplus budget and deficit budget. Surplus budget is the one wherein government's receipts are more than government's expenditure, and deficit budget is the one wherein government expenditure exceeds government receipt. Now, if there is a situation of balanced budget, that is the government's receipts are equal to expenditure, or if there is a situation of surplus budget, that is government's receipts are greater than the government expenditure. So these two situations are favorable for any economy. But deficit budget, this situation is not a good sign or indicator for any economy. So we are going to study the measures of government budget deficit, that is budgetary deficit. We are going to study three types of deficit, budgetary deficit, that is revenue deficit, fiscal deficit and primary deficit. Revenue deficit, it talks about revenue nature, which is regular and recurring in nature. Fiscal talks about borrowings. Borrowings, it indicates the government borrowing. And primary deficit tells you that how much additional loan you have taken in order to repay the interest on previous borrowings. Now, as we can see here, we have formulae for measures of budgetary deficit. The first one, revenue deficit. The formula for the same is revenue expenditure minus revenue receipt. That means when revenue expenditure of the government exceeds the revenue receipt, it is known as revenue deficit. For the same, students, I would like to bring your focus on these terms. As you can see the term here, revenue receipt, you have already studied this. And in the next slide, you can see a term, revenue expenditure. So when this revenue expenditure exceeds this revenue receipt, this situation is known as revenue deficit. Now we talk about fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is a situation when total expenditure exceeds total receipts excluding borrowings. Now, in order to make you understand this, students, I would like to tell you what is total expenditure and what is total receipt. Total expenditure here is equal to revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure. You have studied two types of budget expenditure, that is revenue and capital expenditure, which is equal to total expenditure. And total receipt is equal to revenue receipt plus capital receipt. So both together is known as total receipt. Now fiscal deficit is equal to total expenditure minus total receipt excluding borrowing. That means from total receipt we exclude borrowings. We do not take borrowing is the part of capital receipt. So we do not include this in order to calculate fiscal deficit. Now since fiscal deficit, it indicates the borrowings of the government. So students, we also call fiscal deficit is equal to borrowing. That means this is another formula which we can use to calculate fiscal deficit. Many a times in numerical questions, what happens is that students, the complete information as per this formula is not given. So in that case, only the amount of borrowing is given. So you will be taking You will be using this formula in order to calculate fiscal deficit. Now we talk about primary deficit. Primary deficit is equal to fiscal deficit minus interest payment, or even I call it as primary deficit is equal to borrowings minus interest payment, because fiscal deficit is equal to borrowings. Now what does primary deficit indicate, students? A low or a zero primary deficit is not good for any economy. Why is it so? The reason behind, let me make you understand the situation. Suppose the fiscal deficit, that is, you have taken a borrowing or a loan of rupees 100 crore from rest of the world. Out of that, if you have paid an interest amount of 100 crore, that means whatever loan you have taken, the complete amount you are utilizing for paying interest on the loan which you have already taken. So is the situation good for economy? That means in this case, fiscal deficit is also 100 and interest payment is also 100. So your primary deficit results to 0. So the situation is a worse situation for any economy, because this indicates that whatever loan amount you have taken in the present, you are utilizing the complete loan amount in paying the interest on the previous borrowing. So you are left with 0 amount. So the situation is not good for any economy. On the contrary, if I say fiscal deficit is equal to 100 and interest payment is only 40, that means you have taken a loan of 100 crore. Out of that, you have paid interest on previous borrowing equal to 40 crore. So the answer is 60 crore. That means you are left with 60 crore as primary deficit. So this situation is better than the previous situation, wherein your primary deficit is equal to 0. So students, this is what about the government budget deficit. In the next session, I'm going to explain you certain numericals, how to do, right? Thank you so much.